Some lives turn on a promise spoken by somebody else. Out on the frontier, where wind could sand the paint off a door, and hunger could make a proud woman sell the last good thing she owned, folks learned that a name on paper was not always the truth of a heart. A train ticket could carry a person toward marriage, or shame, or a mercy they had no reason to expect. And sometimes the person waiting at the far end of the track was not the one fate had chosen, but the one God had been quietly shaping all along. Margaret Holloway ran along the platform boards at the Cedar Rock Depot with one gloved hand gripping a cracked brown valise, and the other pressed tight over the little packet of ticket money hidden under her bodice. Dust rolled beneath the train wheels, steam hissed white against the red Utah morning, and the black ribbon on her borrowed hat snapped in the wind like a warning. Her sister's trunk stood beside the baggage cart with the name Clara Holloway painted on a card tied to the handle, and every eye on that platform seemed to know Margaret was not the woman whose photograph had been mailed ahead. The train conductor looked down at her from the steps. "You're the bride for Marshal Jolly." Margaret swallowed. Her throat felt full of coal smoke. "Yes," she said. It was the first lie she had ever spoken that sounded like a prayer. Behind her, the station agent cleared his throat as if shame had lodged there. Two women in traveling cloaks whispered near a stack of flour sacks. A boy with a broom stopped sweeping and stared. Margaret could feel the dust on her hem, the damp of fear under her collar, the bruise of last night's goodbyes still living in her chest. Clara was gone. Clara had left the letter, the photograph, the promise, and the ticket. She had left Margaret with a sick mother in a rented room, a debt collector at the door, and one impossible sentence written in ink that had blurred where tears had fallen. "Take my place, Maggie. He only needs a wife for respectability, not love. You were always stronger than me." The conductor held out his hand for her ticket. Margaret gave it to him before her courage could change its mind. By the time the train pulled into the desert country of San Cordelia, hours later, the afternoon had turned the sky the color of old brass. The wind had a knife edge to it, though the land was dry, and it came sweeping across the flat stretches with grit enough to sting the eyes. Margaret stood on the last step, looking down at a town that seemed to have been hammered together from lumber, sun, and stubbornness. A mercantile with a striped awning, a jail with two barred windows, a church bell hanging in a square tower, mud from an earlier rain drying in ruts along the street. And there, beneath the depot sign, stood a tall man in a black coat gone gray at the cuffs. He wore a marshal's badge pinned over his heart, a broad hat pulled low, and a face that looked as if it had learned not to ask the world for kindness. His jaw was shadowed with dark whiskers. His left hand rested near his gun, not threatening, only practiced. He held a folded letter, worn soft from being opened and closed too many times. Margaret stepped down. The valise tugged at her arm. Her sister's trunk thudded onto the platform behind her. The man looked at the painted name card, then at her. "You're not Clara Holloway," he said. The words were not loud, but every person waiting nearby heard them. Heat flooded Margaret's face. A cattleman turned his head. The station agent pretended to check a ledger. A girl with braids peered from behind her mother's skirt. Margaret's fingers tightened until the valise handle bit her palm. "No," she said. The marshal's eyes did not soften. "Where is she?" "Gone." "Gone where?" Margaret looked past him to the empty road, the hitching posts, the cold wash of wind crossing the boards. "I don't know." A murmur passed along the platform. The two women who had ridden in the rear car stopped near the baggage cart, eager as crows at a fence line. Simon Jolly unfolded the letter and looked at it again, though he must have known every word. "This arrangement was made with Clara Holloway," he said. "Yes. And you came in her place." "Yes." "Without telling me." Margaret's mouth went dry. There was no money to send another wire. A man laughed under his breath. It was not a large laugh, but in that moment it had the cruelty of a slammed door. Simon heard it. His eyes moved toward the man, and the laugh died at once. Margaret held herself still. She had $1.11 after the ticket. Her mother's boarding bill had been paid for 2 weeks, with the last of Clara's earrings. The return fare was impossible. The station behind her smelled of smoke and strangers. Ahead lay a man who had expected her prettier sister and found instead Margaret, with tired eyes, practical hands, and a black dress turned twice at the cuffs. She had nowhere to go. Simon Jolly looked at that truth, as if it had been laid plain on the boards between them. For one long breath, neither moved. Then he bent, picked up Clara's trunk, and took Margaret's valise from her hand without asking. She held onto the handle a moment too long. "I can carry it," she said. "I didn't say you couldn't." His voice was flat, but not unkind. He turned toward the street. "Come on, Miss Holloway." Margaret stayed where she was. "Are you sending me away?" He stopped. The wind lifted the edge of his coat. The badge caught a dull flash of sun. He looked back at her, at the women watching, at the station agent waiting for scandal to finish unfolding. Then Simon Jolly said, "I'll take you." The platform went silent. Margaret felt the words strike somewhere deep, not like romance, not even rescue, but like a hand closing around the edge of a cliff before she fell. He added, "Lower, until we can sort what's lawful, decent, and least cruel. For those listening from your own kitchen, porch, or quiet room tonight, tell us where you are watching from. If this story touches something tender in you, like it, share it with someone who still believes in slow kindness, and subscribe for more frontier love stories." Now let's go back to Margaret and Simon. The wagon waited beside the depot, a black mare hitched in the shafts and flicking her ears against the wind. Simon set the trunk in the back with more care than anger. Margaret climbed up before he could offer a hand. Pride was the only thing she had brought that did not belong to Clara. The ride through San Cordelia lasted only a few minutes, but it felt long enough for every window in town to look out at her. A woman sweeping the porch of the Mercantile stopped with her broom in the air. 2 men outside the livery leaned together. A thin storekeeper with sleeve garters watched from behind the glass, his mouth pinched in a line that promised future talk. "Do they all know?" Margaret asked. Simon kept his eyes on the mare. "Most folks know what they shouldn't." "That doesn't answer me." "No." Margaret looked down at her gloved hands. The gloves had been Clara's too. Pearl buttons at the wrist. One button missing. Simon clicked his tongue to the mare. "They knew I sent for a bride." There was no embarrassment in the way he said it, which somehow made her feel more exposed. "Why?" she asked. His jaw tightened. The wagon wheels rolled through mud, hardened into ridges. A gust carried the smell of wet sage, horse sweat, and coal smoke from the depot. Margaret thought he would not answer. Then he said, "A marshal with no household is an easy target for every widow's cousin and church committee in 3 counties. That sounds inconvenient, not desperate." It became desperate. He did not explain more. They passed the jail. A deputy with sandy hair stepped out, saw Margaret, and took his hat off fast. "Marshal Caleb." The deputy's eyes flicked to her, not rude, curious. Margaret sat straighter. Simon drove on. His house stood behind the jail, set a little apart, built of timber and adobe brick, with a porch just wide enough for 2 chairs. Beyond it, a corral held 2 horses, 1 mule, and a milk cow the color of pale coffee. A stack of chopped wood leaned under a canvas. The yard had been swept, but no flowers grew there. No curtains moved behind the windows. No hen scratched near the step. It was a house made ready by a man who had read a list of what homes required and then stopped before learning why. Inside, the air held the smell of banked ash, leather, coffee, and emptiness. Simon set the trunk in the front room. The furniture was plain. A rough table, 2 chairs, a black stove, a shelf with tin cups, a Bible, a clock that ticked too loudly. A narrow hallway led to 2 closed doors. Margaret stood on the braided rug near the threshold, afraid to step deeper. The room was cleaner than she expected, too clean. Nothing lay out of place because nothing had yet been allowed to belong. Simon removed his hat. "You can take the bedroom on the right," he said. "I'll sleep in the office at the jail until we speak with Reverend Pike." Margaret turned sharply. "That will make talk worse. Talk is already running. I won't have you ruined." That made him look at her fully. The quiet between them shifted. "You came under false pretenses," he said. "I know. You used your sister's promise. I know. You don't get to decide the size of my ruin." The words were hard. Margaret accepted them because they were true. She reached into her coat and pulled out a folded envelope, worn at the creases. "This is Clara's letter, the one she left me. You should read it." Simon did not take it at first. His eyes rested on the paper like it was a snake. At last he reached for it. His fingers brushed hers, cold from the wagon ride. Margaret stepped back, but not before she felt the roughness of his skin. He opened the letter. As he read, his face did not change. That seemed worse than anger. Margaret watched his eyes move across the lines her sister had written in haste and cowardice and despair. "Take my place. He only needs a wife. I cannot bury myself in a desert with a stranger. I am sorry. Tell him I tried to be brave and failed." When Simon folded it again, he held it a moment in his fist. "She should have told me," he said. Yes, should you? Yes. Margaret waited for judgment. She knew how to stand for it. Her father had died owing money. Her mother's lungs had weakened in rooms where the wallpaper peeled. Clara had always been the bright one, the one people forgave. Margaret had been the one who counted pennies, scrubbed cuffs, cut mold from bread, and took blame because blame needed somewhere to sit. Simon laid the letter on the table. "Are you hungry?" The question startled her more than any accusation. No. Her stomach, traitorous and hollow, made a small sound. Simon looked toward the stove. "Sit down," I said. "I'm not hungry." "I heard you." He took a kettle from the stove, poured coffee into a tin cup, then cut 2 slices from a loaf wrapped in cloth. The bread was dry, but he set molasses beside it, and a crock of beans warmed near the fire. He moved with the stiff competence of a man accustomed to doing for himself, and not asking comfort of the work. Margaret remained standing. Simon placed a plate at the table. "Miss Holloway, I arrest men for lying with worse reasons than hunger and fear." "Sit." Her eyes stung. She hated him for noticing. She sat. He took the other chair but did not eat until she picked up the bread. The molasses trembled on her knife because her hand shook. She ate slowly at first, then too quickly, then stopped in shame. Simon looked away toward the window and gave her the kindness of not seeing. Outside, wind scraped dirt against the house. After the meal, he showed her the room. It had a narrow bed with a clean quilt, a washstand, a peg for clothes, and a small square window facing the corral. On the bed lay a folded nightdress still wrapped in brown paper. Margaret stared at it. "Mrs. Bell at the Mercantile chose it," Simon said. "I didn't know sizes for Clara, is." The word landed gently and still cut. Margaret touched the paper. "She is smaller than me. I can return it." "No." She drew her hand back. "No, it can be altered." The room held one other thing, a small vase on the washstand with dried lavender in it. Not fresh, not pretty anymore, but placed there with intention. Margaret looked at Simon. He cleared his throat. "Mrs. Bell said women like flowers." A laugh almost came out of Margaret, but grief stopped it halfway, and the sound became something fragile. Simon looked embarrassed. "I'll be at the jail. Bolt the door after me. There's a shotgun behind the flour bin. Don't touch it unless you mean to fire. You're leaving me alone. You're safer alone here than beside me under a roof tonight, according to town law and church law both. And according to you." He paused in the doorway. "According to me, you looked ready to drop on that platform. Then you left." Margaret bolted the door. She stood in the middle of the bedroom surrounded by things meant for her sister. The trunk smelled of Clara's rose soap when she opened it. Dresses folded neatly, a hairbrush with silver initials, a ribbon the color of summer cherries. Beneath them, tucked in the corner, was a photograph of Clara smiling beside Margaret on a city sidewalk 3 years before sorrow thinned them both. Margaret sat on the bed and held the photograph until lamplight blurred. Outside, the Utah wind beat against the walls like someone asking to be let in. She did not sleep much. By morning the rain came. It began before dawn as a whisper along the roof and turned by sunrise to a cold slanting sheet that painted the windows gray. Margaret woke shivering, dressed in her own plain black, and found the kitchen fire nearly dead. She knelt, coaxed flame from coals, and made coffee from grounds Simon had left in a tin. Her fingers knew stoves. They knew flour sacks, water buckets, mending needles, and the narrow pride of making a poor room decent. When Simon opened the back door at first light, rain dripping from the brim of his hat, he stopped. The kitchen smelled of coffee and biscuit. Margaret stood at the table with flour on her wrist. You had lard, flour, and sour milk. I used them. He looked at the biscuits, as if they were evidence from a crime. You didn't have to. No, she said. I had to do something. His coat was soaked dark across the shoulders. There was mud on his boots and a weariness around his eyes that had not been there the day before. Prisoner give trouble? She asked. His brows lifted slightly. I saw the jail from the window. Drunk miner. Thought he could buy Caleb, did he? Only one. She set a cup of coffee near his hand. He did not touch it right away. I have to speak with Reverend Pike after breakfast, he said, about whether I can stay, about how. That was different enough to make her look at him. Rain tapped hard on the glass. The house seemed smaller with the weather pressing close. He took the coffee. Thank you, he said. It was the first gentle thing he had said without hiding it inside a command. They ate standing at opposite sides of the table, like two people sharing shelter in a storm rather than a future. Simon told her plainly that the marriage license had been prepared for Clara Holloway and Simon Jolly. It would not do as it stood. Reverend Pike could marry them only if Margaret entered willingly, under her own name, with witnesses. The town council would talk. The church women would measure. The man Simon had arrested last month would spit lies if it helped him. And you still mean to go through with it? Margaret asked. Simon set his cup down. Do you? The question had more weight than she expected. She wiped flour from her wrist with a cloth. My mother is alive because your ticket came. I paid her board. I bought medicine. I came because there was nowhere else. That is not the same as wanting marriage. No, I want pretend affection. I didn't ask you to. And I won't be treated like stolen goods. His gaze sharpened. No one in this house will treat you so. There it was again. Not warmth, not romance, but a boundary drawn in iron. Margaret nodded once. Then, yes. If the law allows it, and if the terms are honest, I will marry you. Simon's mouth tightened, not with displeasure exactly, but as if something old in him had flinched at the word honest. They walked to the church under one umbrella that did not cover both. By the time they reached Main Street, Margaret's hem was soaked 6 inches up. Mud sucked at her boots. Rain ran from the brim of Simon's hat down his collar. Twice he slowed so she could step around deep ruts. Once, at the crossing, he put his hand beneath her elbow without looking at her. She took the help because pride was less useful than dry ankles. Though she felt every eye through every window. Mrs. Bell opened the mercantile door as they passed. Marshal C. called. You both catch your death. Come stand in a dry place a minute. Simon looked to Margaret. She lifted her chin. A minute. Inside the mercantile, warmth smelled of coffee beans, lamp oil, calico, and cured ham. Mrs. Bell was a round woman with bright eyes and a measuring tape draped around her neck. She looked at Margaret not with pity but with swift inventory. Wet ham, pale face, Clara's gloves, no wedding ring. That's so, Mrs. Bell said softly. You are the sister. Margaret braced. Ah, yes. Mrs. Bell nodded, as if that answer contained enough courage to stand on its own. Then you'll need wool stockings. That desert rain lies. It says autumn, then turns winter by sundown. I can pay later, Margaret said before she could stop herself. The store went quiet. Behind the counter, Mr. Bell looked up from a ledger, his face pinched with displeasure. We've had enough of paying later in this town. Simon turned his head. Mrs. Bell's cheeks reddened. Horace, but Margaret stepped forward. She opened the small purse at her wrist and placed a nickel on the counter, then 2 pennies, then the last 4 cents. 11 cents. She arranged them in a careful row. That is what I have, she said. Tell me what it buys. Mr. Bell stared. Mrs. Bell's eyes softened. Simon did not reach for his own pocket. Margaret loved him a little for that, before she knew enough to call it by another name. Thread, Mrs. Bell said briskly. Good thread and 2 needles. Stockings are on credit from me, not the store. No, Margaret said. Yes, Mrs. Bell replied, because I have eyes and know a woman who can sew when I see one. You can mend for me if you care to square it. Margaret looked down at the coins, then at Mrs. Bell. I can sew plain, mend fine, alter dresses, set cuffs, remake collars, and turn sheets. Then you'll be useful, not pretty, not pitiful. Useful. Margaret picked up the thread and stockings with hands that felt steadier. At the church, Reverend Pike asked questions in a low voice and listened to the answers. He was a narrow man with kind hands, the kind of preacher whose boots sowed mud because he visited people on bad roads. He did not pretend the situation was simple. Miss Holloway, he said, do you enter this promise because you are forced? No, because you are afraid? Margaret looked at Simon. His face gave nothing away. Not demand, not hope, only attention. Yes, she said. In part. The Reverend nodded slowly. Fear is a poor minister, but it is often present at the beginning of honest roads. Is there anything else? Margaret thought of the platform, of Simon taking her valise, of bread set down without humiliation, of coffee accepted in the rain. Duty, she said, and the wish to live with my name intact. Simon's eyes lowered. Reverend Pike turned to him. Marshal Jolly. Simon removed his hat. Rain had flattened his dark hair. I need a household to quiet town pressure, yes. I need help managing a life that has become too bare, yes. But I won't take vows over a woman who believes herself trapped. Margaret looked at him sharply. He continued, if she chooses to leave, I'll find a way to send her. With what money? Margaret asked. Simon met her eyes. Mine. The word moved through her like heat from a stove. Reverend Pike watched them both. Then we will do this plainly, under her true name, before witnesses, and you will give each other patience before affection is asked. They were married that afternoon, with rain shaking the church windows. Mrs. Bell stood witness beside Deputy Caleb. Margaret wore her black dress brushed clean at the hem, Clara's altered hat and wool stockings still damp from the walk. Simon wore his marshal's coat and a white shirt that had been mended at the cuff with thread too dark. His hand, when he took hers, was cold. His voice did not tremble on the vows, but it changed when he said her name, Margaret Holloway, not Clara. Afterward no rice was thrown. No music played. Mrs. Bell kissed Margaret's cheek and slipped a parcel of sugar into her hands. Caleb shook Simon's hand and said, Well, Marshal, I reckon the house will sound different now. Simon only nodded. Outside, the rain had turned to sleet. Their first night, as husband and wife, Simon slept on a cot in the kitchen. Margaret protested because the room was cold and the arrangement absurd. But he only carried in a folded blanket and set his gun belt on a chair. The town can say what it wants, he said. You'll know what is true. That is not comfortable, neither is gossip. She stood in the bedroom doorway, shawl around her shoulders. Are you always this stubborn? Yes, at least you answer honestly, not always. It was the first time she saw something like pain cross his face before he turned away. She lay in the narrow bed and listened to the house. The stove settling, rain ticking against the eaves, Simon shifting once on the cot, then lying still. The knowledge of him just beyond the wall made the darkness less empty and more dangerous. Not dangerous in body, in possibility. Morning brought snow in the high ridges east of town and cold mud in the yard. Marriage did not make life tender. It made it busy. Margaret rose before Simon lit the stove and found the coffee. She scrubbed the table with sand until the old stains lightened. She washed the curtains Simon had never hung and discovered them folded in a crate, stiff from store starch. She set beans to soak, swept ash, shook the rug, and stood on a chair to wipe smoke from the lamp glass. By noon her back ached, and the house smelled less like a bachelor's shelter, and more like work meant to continue. Simon came in at midday with a cut over his knuckles, and blood dried along his tomb. Margaret saw it before he hid his hand. Sit, she said. I have work, then bleed on your own papers. He stared at her. She pointed to the chair. He sat. She brought water, soap, and a strip torn from a clean sheet. His knuckles were broad, scarred in old places. The new cut was ugly but not deep. Prisoner again? She asked. Teamster. Didn't like paying a fine? Did you hit him first? No, good. His mouth moved, almost a smile. She cleaned the wound. He did not flinch until she poured whiskey over it. Sorry, she said, though she was not. No, you're not. No. This time the smile came, small and tired, gone quickly. At supper he ate her stew without complaint, though she knew it needed salt. He fixed the loose hinge on the pantry door, while she mended his cuff. Later he brought in extra wood without being asked and left his dry coat near her bedroom door, because the hallway caught a draft. Neither mentioned it. Days gathered like stitches. Margaret learned the sounds of Simon's work. The jail door closing, Caleb's laugh, a horse brought hard into the yard, boots on the porch at odd hours. She learned he drank coffee black, disliked carrots, polished his badge only when troubled, and stood with his back to walls in public rooms. She learned the town had more widows than mercy, more opinions than money, and a habit of deciding a woman's worth by how softly she accepted insult. She did not accept softly. At Mrs. Bell's mercantile, she began mending for credit. She sat near the stove with other women on washing mornings, turning collars and patching boys' trousers, while talk moved around her like a river looking for a weak bank. Must be strange, Mrs. Cutter said one morning, to air another woman's expectations. Margaret kept her needle moving. I find expectations usually fit poorly no matter whose they are. Mrs. Bell choked on a laugh behind the counter. Mrs. Cutter's mouth tightened. I only meant your sister was the intended bride. My sister was intended for many things she lacked courage to meet. The room quieted. Margaret tied off the thread, bit it clean, and folded the trousers. S.O. was I, perhaps, but I am here. After that, the women still talked, but not as freely in front of her. Simon heard of it, because Marshals heard everything eventually. That evening he stood in the kitchen while Margaret rolled pie crust with a bottle because the house had no rolling pin. You defended yourself at Bell's. She dusted flour from her fingers. Was I not meant to? I'm glad you did. The bottle moved once more, then stopped. Compliments had a way of making her clumsy. She insulted Clara, too, Margaret said. You still defend her. She is my sister. She left you. Yes. Margaret pressed the crust into a tin. That does not erase her from my blood. Simon leaned against the doorframe. No, something in his voice made her look up. Who left you? She asked. His face closed. No one worth naming. That usually means someone worth naming very much. He took his hat from the peg. I'll be late. The door shut behind him. Margaret stood with her hands in flour, feeling she had stepped close to a locked room and heard something breathing inside. The object from Simon's past appeared 3 nights later. Margaret found it while searching the bottom drawer of the washstand for a spare candle. A small blue hair ribbon lay folded beneath an old handkerchief, tied around a tintype of a young woman with solemn eyes. The woman was not beautiful in Clara's bright way, but there was a steadiness to her mouth that made Margaret linger. On the back of the tintype, someone had scratched the name Ruth. Margaret put it back at once. She told herself she had no right to ask. That night, wind rose hard after sunset. It came across the desert with a low moan, rattling the shutters and driving sand into the cracks of the door. Simon had not returned by supper. Margaret kept stew warm until the potatoes began to break apart. She set his plate near the stove, then moved it back to the table, then covered it with another plate to hold the heat. At 9, the church bell rang once by accident, shoved by wind. At 10, a horse stumbled into the yard. Margaret opened the door before Simon knocked. He stood there with a boy in his arms. The child was maybe 7, soaked through, his face white against Simon's coat. Behind them, Deputy Caleb led 2 horses, one limping. "Bed," Simon said. Margaret turned down her own blankets without a question. The boy's name was Eli Mason. His father had been thrown from a wagon on the North Road. The father was at the doctor's. The boy had ridden for help and fallen in a wash, then walked until Simon found him half frozen under a cedar. Margaret stripped the wet clothes while Simon turned his back. She wrapped the boy in warm flannel, heated stones for his feet, rubbed his cold hands between hers, and coaxed a spoonful of sugared coffee into his mouth when he began to shake. "Ma," Eli whispered. Margaret's hands stilled. Simon, standing near the door, said quietly, "She's gone, son." The boy's eyes closed. A tear slid into his hair. Margaret sat beside him until he slept. When she came into the kitchen, Simon was at the table with both hands wrapped around a cup he had not drunk from. Mud streaked his trousers. His face looked carved down to bone. "Hell live," Margaret said. Simon nodded. "You found him in this wind?" "Yes, that was dangerous." "Yes, does danger always answer when you call?" His eyes lifted to hers. For once, he looked too tired to build walls. "A child crimed us." The words opened something in the room. Margaret sat across from him. The lamp flame bent with a draft. For a long while, neither spoke. At last she said, "Ruth." His hand tightened on the cup. "I saw the tintype. I was not prying. I needed a candle." He looked toward the dark hallway. "My wife," he said. Margaret's breath caught. "I thought you had not married." "I don't say widower unless asked." "And no one asked?" "Too many did." She waited. Simon rubbed a hand over his face. "Ruth died 5 years ago. Fever took her in 3 days. Our daughter went the morning after." The wind struck the house. Margaret's heart seemed to fold around that sentence. "Our daughter. I'm sorry," she said, and the words felt too small to carry anything. Simon looked down. "I was out serving a warrant when Ruth first took sick. She told Caleb not to fetch me, because the man I'd gone after was dangerous. Said duty was duty." He laughed once without humor. "When I came home, she was burning up. Baby was crying. I still had blood on my sleeve from the arrest. I washed my hands before I touched them." As if that mattered, Margaret did not move. Simon's voice went lower. "I built this house for noise. Ruth singing, a cradle, children underfoot. After they died, every board in it accused me. So I worked, kept working, became useful to everyone, except the dead." Margaret thought of the clean, bare rooms, the dried lavender, the cot in the kitchen, a man making a home from a list because memory had stolen the rest. "You sent for Clara because you wanted the house filled again," she said. His eyes flashed. "No." She regretted it once, but then he exhaled. "My baby, not with love. I didn't trust that. I thought arrangement would be safer. A woman who wanted respectability, a household, boundaries, no foolish hopes. Margaret looked at her hands. And you got a liar in a borrowed hat. He looked at her for a long moment. I got Margaret Holloway, he said. It was not a declaration, it was less and more, a name spoken as if it had weight. The boy stirred in the bedroom, and Margaret rose before emotion could show on her face. Eli stayed 3 days, because rain washed the north road into a ribbon of mud, and his father's leg was broken badly enough that Dr. Mercer would not let him move. Those 3 days changed the house more than any vow had. A child made emptiness impossible. Eli left crumbs on the table, asked questions no adult would dare, cried at night for his mother, and followed Simon with hungry admiration. Margaret found him trying to polish the marshal's badge with a dish rag and stopped him just before he rubbed off the shine. That badge is not a toy, she said. Eli's chin trembled. Ei was helping. Simon, from the doorway, said, He can help. Margaret turned. It is yours. Simon took the badge off and placed it on the table. Then I say he can help. So Eli polished it while Margaret made bread, and Simon stood at the window, pretending not to watch the boy's small, serious hands. On the second night, Eli woke screaming from a dream. Simon reached the bedroom first, but stopped at the threshold, as if the sound of a child's fear had turned him to salt. Margaret brushed past him, gathered Eli against her, and rocked him until the sobs eased. Simon stood in the hallway, face pale. Later, when Eli slept, Margaret found Simon on the porch in the cold with no coat. She brought the coat and put it over his shoulders. You could come in, she said. I heard my daughter, he whispered. Margaret sat beside him. The porch boards were damp. Clouds moved fast across the moon. What was her name? Simon's throat worked. Anna. Margaret looked out at the muddy yard. Anna is a good name. He closed his eyes. She did not touch him. She only sat there until the cold drove them both inside. When Eli's uncle came to fetch him, the boy clung to Margaret's skirt, then to Simon's leg. Simon bent and spoke low to him, giving the boy a small carved horse he had whittled during the rain. Eli held it like treasure. After the wagon left, the house felt hollow again. Margaret went to strip the bed. Simon stood in the doorway. Leave the blanket? Why? His eyes moved to the small shape still pressed in the quilt where the child had slept. Just leave it today. So she did. Winter came early to San Cordelia. Not deep snow at first, but cold winds and nights that silvered the water bucket with ice. Margaret learned to split kindling when Simon was gone. To learn, she could do it, and stopped apologizing every time she brought in wood. She bought hens with sewing credit and built their nesting boxes herself from scrap lumber behind the livery. Simon watched her hammer one crooked nail, take it out, straighten it on the step, and drive it true. You've done that before, he said. My father believed a daughter should know how to fix what no one else had time to fix. What else did he believe? That debts disappear if ignored. Simon winced slightly. He was not a bad man, Margaret said, only weak in the places life pressed hardest. She looked toward the town road. Clara took after him more than she knows. Do you hate her? Margaret held a board steady with her knee. Some mornings, and other mornings, I worry whether she has eaten. Simon picked up another nail and handed it to her. Their fingers touched. This time she did not pull away as quickly. Letters began to pass between Margaret and her mother. Simon paid postage without remark by leaving coins beneath the lamp. Margaret found them every other Monday, always exact, never mentioned. In the first letter, her mother wrote that Clara had been seen boarding east with a traveling salesman named Mr. Voss. In the second, that the debt collector had come again, but found nothing to take. In the third, that winter had worsened her cough. Margaret read that one twice, then folded it carefully and placed it under her plate at supper, because she did not trust her hands. Simon noticed. He waited until she had eaten 3 bites, How bad? She looked up. Your mother. Margaret pressed the letter flatter. Bad enough? You want to go? Yes. Then go. With what money? He was silent. She hated the old ache rising in her. Do not offer what we do not have. I have some. You have taxes due on the house, feed bills, and half the town owing you favors instead of cash. I keep the account book. That surprised him. You read my ledger. It was under the flour sack. That is not an answer. You should hide private papers better. A flash of annoyance passed through his eyes, then faded into something like respect. There's money in the bank. There is money promised to the bank. He leaned back. You've been here 2 months and already know my trouble better than Caleb. Caleb does not dust under ledgers. Outside, sleet tapped the window. Margaret folded the letter again. I will not take your last money to chase a dying woman across frozen miles. She is your mother. And you are my husband-in-law. If not in heart, your ruin would still be mine. The moment the words left her, she wished them back. Simon stood slowly. If not in heart, Simon, no, it's true. He took his coat from the peg. Where are you going? Jail. It is supper. I'm not hungry. He left, and the door closed softly. That was worse than a slam. Margaret sat alone with the lamp burning low, the letter under her hand, and the stew cooling between 2 bowls. She had wounded him because she was afraid of needing him. It was the kind of cruelty practical people excuse as honesty. At midnight, she wrapped his supper in a cloth and carried it to the jail. Snow had begun in earnest, small hard flakes whipping across Main Street. The town was dark, except for the jail lamp and a thin line of light under the mercantile door. Margaret held her shawl tight and crossed the street with her boots slipping in the ruts. Simon sat at his desk, writing. He looked up when she entered. You shouldn't be out in this. You shouldn't miss supper to punish yourself for my bad words. His pen stilled. She set the wrapped bowl on the desk. I did not mean you have no place in my heart. The lamp crackled. That is not the same as saying I do, he said. No. His face lowered. Margaret drew a breath. I do not know what to call the place you have. It is not the foolish thing girls whisper over ribbon. It is not simple gratitude. It is not yet trust without fear. But when you are late, I listen for your horse. When you leave coins for postage, I pretend not to see because kindness without witness seems important to you. When Eli cried, I saw where your grief lies, and I have been careful around that room ever since. Simon did not move. Her voice softened. That is something of the heart. I am only too proud and too frightened to name it cleanly. He looked at her then, and his eyes had no defense in them. Margaret, he said. That was all. Her name, less than a speech, more than she could safely hold. A shout came from the cells. Simon stood at once. Stay back. A prisoner named Laugh Drummond, jailed for robbery, had worked a loose bar from the cot frame and struck Caleb when he brought water. By the time Simon reached the cell, Drummond had one arm around Caleb's throat and blood on his teeth. Margaret did not scream. She saw Caleb's pistol on the desk. She saw Simon draw but not fire because Caleb was in the way. She saw the stove poker near the wall. She took it. When Drummond dragged Caleb backward, Margaret stepped to the side of the bars and drove the poker hard across the man's wrist. He howled. The cot bar clanged to the floor. Simon moved like winter lightning inside the cell, one blow, then iron cuffs closing. Afterward, Caleb sat on the floor gasping. Margaret's hands shook so badly she dropped the poker. Simon came out of the cell. Are you hurt? No. He took her wrists, turning her palms up, searching for blood. There was none. His hands were firm, warm, alive. You could have been killed, he said. So could Caleb. That is not an answer. It is the only one I had. Caleb, holding his throat, rasped, Mamisis, jolly, remind me never to cross you near fireplace tools. Margaret laughed once, breathless and almost wild. Simon did not laugh. He pulled her into him so suddenly, she had no time to decide whether to allow it. His arms closed around her, hard and shaking. She stood stiff for one heartbeat, then another. Then she let her forehead rest against his coat. He smelled of snow, ink, leather, and fear. The embrace lasted only a few seconds. He released her as if remembering every boundary at once. "I'm sorry," he said. "I'm not," Margaret answered. The words changed the room. But love, if that was what had begun, did not make trouble step aside. Leif Drummond had brothers. 2 days after the jail attack, one of them rode into San Cordelia and stood outside the Mercantile telling anyone who would listen that Marshal Jolly had married a false bride and hidden behind her skirts. By evening, the story had grown teeth. Margaret had seduced Simon. Margaret had stolen her sister's place for money. Margaret had come west with debts and loose morals. Margaret had struck a prisoner because violence ran in her family. Simon found out when he entered Bell's for coffee and saw Margaret standing by the dry goods counter, white-faced but silent, while Mr. Bell refused her sewing credit. "I run a respectable store," Horace Bell said. Mrs. Bell stood near the fabric bolts, furious but trapped by the fact that her husband owned the ledger. Margaret gathered her sewing basket. "Then I will not trouble it." Simon stepped inside, snow melting on his shoulders. "You will apologize." Horace turned. "Marshal, this is store business. It became my business when you insulted my wife." The word wife moved through the store with force. Horace swallowed. "I only said until matters are settled." "What matters?" The storekeeper looked around for help and found none willing to meet Simon's eye. Simon removed his hat. His voice stayed even, which made it more dangerous. "Margaret Jolly married me under her own name, before Reverend Pike, Mrs. Bell, and Deputy Mason. She has paid for every item taken from this store by labor or coin. She defended my deputy when a criminal tried to kill him. She has brought more order to my house in 2 months than I managed in 5 years. If your respectability cannot hold room for a woman who works, keeps her word, and survives shame she did not start, then your respectability is too small to weigh." Margaret stared at him. Horace's mouth opened, closed, opened again. "I meant no offense." "Yes, you did," Mrs. Bell snapped. "Now apologize proper." Horace's face reddened. "Mrs. Jolly, I apologize." Margaret felt every woman in the room watching. She wanted to say something sharp. She wanted to win. Instead, she looked at Simon, standing there with his hat in his hands, spending his reputation like money. "I accept," she said quietly, "but I will take my sewing through Mrs. Pike until spring." Mrs. Bell's eyes shone. Outside, Simon walked her home through falling snow. "You did not have to do that," Margaret said. "I know. You made enemies. I already had them. For me, then." He looked down at her. Snow caught in his lashes. Jans. The simple word warmed her more than the shawl. At home, she hung his coat by the stove and brushed snow from the shoulders before it melted into the wool. He washed her hands. She knew he watched. Neither spoke. That night he moved his cot from the kitchen to the front room because the kitchen had become too cold. Margaret did not argue. Before bed, she set an extra quilt at the foot of the cot. In the morning, she found it folded and placed over her own chair by the stove. The midpoint came with Clara, not Clara herself, but a letter bearing her handwriting, delivered on a raw January afternoon when the sky was low and yellow with coming storm. Margaret knew the hand before she broke the seal. Simon was at the jail. The house was quiet, except for the hens muttering under the shed and the clock ticking in the room where lavender had long since lost its scent. "Dear Maggie, I heard you married him. I suppose that means my cowardice turned to your advantage, though you will not see it so. Voss left me in Denver. I have taken work at a laundry. I am ashamed, but not enough to come back and be looked at by you. Mother writes that she is worse. She asks for you. I cannot go. I cannot bear sick rooms any more. You were always better with suffering. There was more, but Margaret stopped reading there. You were always better with suffering. The sentence sat on the page like a commandment. By dusk, Margaret had packed her valise. She put in 2 dresses, stockings, the photograph of her and Clara, her sewing scissors, and the small packet of coins she had saved from mending. Not enough for full fare. Enough to get part way if she begged work along the road. She left Simon's house clean, bread wrapped on the table, coffee ground for morning, firewood stacked, a note beside the lamp. Simon, my mother needs me. I cannot ask you to pay what you do not have, and I cannot stay warm here while she dies calling for me. You said once that if I chose to leave, you would find a way to send me. I am sparing you that burden. What you have given me was more than I deserved under the circumstances. I hope one day the town gives you peace. Margaret, she did not write wife. The storm broke as she reached the depot. Wind drove snow sideways so hard, it erased the far end of the platform. The boards were slick under her boots. Her valise bumped her knee. The ticket window was closed, but a lamp burned inside, and she could see the station agent counting receipts. She knocked until he opened with irritation already formed. No trains tonight, he said. Tracks drifted east of Millwash. When morning, if the plow clears, be noon, be not. Margaret tightened her grip on the valise. I wait in this. She looked down the platform. The bench beneath the awning was crusted white. Wind pushed snow through every gap. Waiting there would be misery, but misery was familiar. I'll wait, she repeated. The agent's eyes moved over her face. Her thin shawl, the valise. Marshal know you were here? Margaret said nothing. He sighed. I can't open the office. Rules. Oh, of course. She sat on the bench with her valise against her ankles and Clara's old hat pulled low. Snow gathered on her skirt. The depot boards shuddered under the wind. Somewhere in town, a loose shutter banged again and again like a warning. Nobody answered. After an hour, her feet went numb. After 2, she stopped feeling her fingers. She thought of her mother's cough, of Clara in a Denver laundry, of Simon's coat hanging by the stove, of the blue ribbon in a drawer, of the word wife spoken in the mercantile as if it meant protection, not ownership. She lowered her head and cried without sound because the wind would steal even that. Hoofbeats came near midnight. Margaret looked up through snow. Simon stepped onto the platform carrying a lantern in one hand and her note in the other. His face was pale with cold and anger and something worse. Stand up, he said. I'm not going back. I didn't ask that. Stand up before you freeze to death. She tried. Her legs were stiff. He set the lantern down and took both her arms, lifting her to her feet. You read my note, she said. Yes, I have to go. Yes, I will not take your money. I sewed the roan. The wind seemed to stop inside her ears. What? I sold the roan to Wilkes for less than she's worth because he had cash and a covered wagon, leaving south at dawn, once roads clear. Dr. Mercer wrote a letter for the physician near your mother. Caleb will watch the jail. Reverend Pike's sister will take the hens. Margaret stared at him. Simon bent, picked up her valise. We leave when the road opens. We, yes, you cannot leave your post. I asked the boss for leave. He granted it. No, then I resigned. The lantern flame snapped in the wind. Margaret could not speak. Simon's jaw worked. You thought sparing me meant vanishing into a blizzard with $11 and pride enough to kill you. That is not sparing. That is leaving me to find your body and call it independence. I couldn't cost you everything. He stepped closer. Snow clung to the brim of his hat, to his shoulders, to the dark line of his lashes. You are not a cost, he said. The sentence was simple. It struck harder than any grand vow. Margaret's breath broke. You love that work, she whispered. I hid in that work. There is a difference. I'm learning it. Her gloved hand rose to her mouth. Simon looked toward the dark track, then back at her. I told a platform once that I would take you. I did not understand what I was saying. I do now. Not Clara's promise, not town pressure, not a bargain to keep gossip off my porch. You, Margaret Holloway, jolly, angry, proud, half-frozen, carrying everyone's grief like it was laundry to be washed. I'll take you, and I'll go with you, if you'll still have me beside you. She closed her eyes. The tears that came then were hot, despite the cold. I am afraid, she said. So am I. My mother might die before we reach her. I know. The town will talk. Let it wear out its tongue. You sold Ruth's roan. His face changed, and pain moved across it. Ruth loved that horse. Simon, I know. His voice roughened. But Ruth is not in the barn. You were on this platform. Margaret reached for him then. Not because he was falling, because she chose to. He held her in the snow while the train tracks disappeared beneath white, and the depot lamp burned low behind them. They did not travel at dawn. The storm held the town in its fist for 2 full days. Those 2 days made shelter a kind of confession. The depot was impossible, the roads closed, and the jail office too public. So Simon brought Margaret home, where Mrs. R. Bell and Reverend Pike's wife arrived by mid-morning with blankets, broth, and opinions disguised as help. Dr. Mercer checked Margaret's fingers for frostbite and ordered her near the stove. Simon accepted every scolding in silence and fed the fire until the kitchen grew warm enough to fog the windows. By evening, the storm had buried the porch steps. Margaret sat wrapped in 2 quilts, ashamed of her own weakness. Simon made coffee badly and burned toast worse. She ate both without complaint. You need salt in the beans, she said. I know. You always know and never fix it. I was waiting for you to complain. She looked at him, and a small smile moved between them like a candle flame. He slept in the chair that night, because she had frightened him too deeply for him to leave the room. Near dawn, she woke and saw his head tipped back, his hand resting open on his knee. The lines of his face softened in sleep. A man who had given up badge, horse, certainty, and pride in one night. A man still wearing grief, but no longer letting it stand between him and the living. Margaret rose quietly, took the blue ribbon from the washstand drawer, and placed it beside Ruth's tintype on the shelf in the front room. Not hidden, not forgotten, honored. When Simon saw it, he stood still for a long time. Then he said, "Thank you," nothing more, nothing less. On the 3rd morning, the sky cleared hard and blue. Snow lay in ridges along fences and roofs, but the road south had been broken by freight wagons. Simon and Margaret left before noon in Wilkes' covered wagon, with 2 borrowed horses, a sack of oats, bread, dried apples, blankets, Dr. Mercer's letter, and every coin Simon had received for the roan, tucked into Margaret's purse. San Cordelia watched them go. Horace Bell stood in his doorway looking uncomfortable. Mrs. Bell waved with both hands. Caleb, still bruised at the throat, saluted Margaret with solemn mischief. Reverend Pike raised a hand in blessing. At the edge of town, Simon stopped the wagon. The marshal's badge was no longer on his coat. Margaret looked at the place where it had been. "Do you miss it already?" she asked. He clicked to the horses. "Yes, I am sorry. I'm not." That was not entirely true, but it was true enough for love. The journey took them across country that seemed made of distance. Red rock, pale grass, frozen washes, cedar shadows, and long evenings when the cold came down as soon as the sun dropped. Weather ruled them, mud slowed them, ice forced them to lead the horses down slopes. One night rain found a tear in the wagon canvas and dripped steadily onto Margaret's shoulder until Simon moved his own blanket over her side and sat awake holding a tin cup beneath the leak. "You cannot hold that all night," she murmured. "I can hold it a while." In the morning, she found his sleeve soaked and his hands stiff from cold. She warmed his fingers between both of hers, breathing into them, as he had once seen her do for Eli. He watched her. "You don't have to. I know." A day later, one horse went lame. They lost half a day rubbing the leg, packing it with snow, and walking beside the wagon. Margaret's boots blistered. Simon noticed, though she hid it badly. That evening he took her boot, peeled the stocking away from raw skin, and bandaged her heel with a tenderness that made her look away. "My feet are not a tragedy," she said. "No, you act as if they are. I have learned small hurts become large when ignored." She looked back at him then. The firelight moved across his face. "Who taught you?" "You." Silence settled, warm despite the cold. In a mining town 2 days from the rail connection, they found news waiting, like a blow. A telegram had been forwarded to the local station under Simon's name because Dr. Mercer had wired ahead. Margaret's mother had died the previous morning. The station office smelled of ink, wet wool, and coal smoke. Margaret read the telegram once. Her lips did not move. She folded it neatly, then unfolded it, as if the words might rearrange into mercy. Simon stood beside her, close but not touching. "I was too late," she said. He said nothing false. Outside, men shouted over freight. A child cried because his mitten had fallen in the mud. The world continued with obscene, ordinary sound. Margaret pressed the telegram to her chest. "She asked for me, yes. I was not there. No." Her breath shook. Clara was not there either. No. A hard, bitter laugh came from her. "We are a faithful pair of daughters." Simon took his hat off. "Margaret," Denise turned on him. "Do not comfort me. Do not tell me I did all I could. I know every mile between here and that room. I know every hour I waited because snow fell and trains failed and pride made me delay. I know." He accepted the anger because he knew it was only grief with nowhere decent to stand. "All right," he said. That undid her. She folded forward, and he caught her before she reached the floor. He sat with her on the bench in the station office while she cried against his coat, not prettily, not softly, but with the whole weight of being the strong daughter too long. Men came in and left quieter. The station clerk set a cup of water near them and did not speak. When the storm of grief passed enough for speech, Margaret whispered, "I have no one now." Simon's arms tightened. "You have me." She closed her eyes. "That sounds like pity." "No. It sounds like my whole life changing shape." They buried her mother in a small town cemetery 3 days later. Clara came. Margaret saw her sister standing beyond the iron gate in a gray dress too thin for the weather, face pale, hands bare. Clara looked older than her 24 years. Beauty remained, but it had been frightened down to something human. For a moment, neither sister moved. Then Clara said, "Maggie." Margaret wanted to strike her, wanted to embrace her, wanted to be 10 years old again, before debt and fever and marriage letters and impossible trains. "You missed her," Margaret said. Clara's mouth trembled. "I know. She asked for us." "I know. Do you?" Clara's eyes filled. "No, but I know enough to hate myself." Simon stood a few steps away, giving them room, his hat in his hand. Clara looked at him. Shame colored her face. "Marshal Jolly, not Marshall anymore," Simon said. That startled her. Margaret looked at him too. He had not said it aloud that plainly before. Clara swallowed. "I am sorry for what I did to you." Simon's gaze rested on her without cruelty. "You did not want the life offered. I lied. I sent Margaret into it. Clara flinched. Margaret expected satisfaction. None came. Snow began to fall in soft flakes, settling on the dark shoulders of mourners and the raw mound of earth. The preacher in that town spoke words about dust and eternal rest. Margaret heard only fragments. "Mother, mercy, home." The wind carried the rest away. After the burial, Clara took from her pocket a small cloth purse. "This is not much," she said to Margaret. Laundry wages. I want you to have it. Margaret looked at the purse, then at Clara's reddened hands. No, Maggie, no. Keep your wages. Eat, buy gloves. Stop finding men who look like exits. Clara began to cry silently. Margaret stepped closer. You owe me truth, not money. Clara nodded. And you owe yourself a life you do not abandon when it becomes hard. Another nod. Margaret looked at her sister a long moment, then drew her into an embrace that was not forgiveness entire, but the beginning of something less poisonous. Clara clung to her like a child. Simon looked away, giving them privacy among the graves. They did not bring Clara back with them. She had work in Denver and, perhaps for the first time, the will to keep it. Margaret and Simon left her at the station with gloves bought from Simon's remaining money and a packet of bread Margaret had wrapped without comment. As the train pulled away, Clara pressed her palm to the glass. Margaret lifted hers. Then the train took one sister east and left the other facing west. The return journey to San Cordelia was quieter. Grief rode with them, but not as an enemy. It sat in the wagon under blankets, in the pauses between words, in the way Simon made sure Margaret ate, even when food tasted of nothing, in the way Margaret brushed snow from his hat brim while he repaired a trace. At night they spoke of small things because large things were too tender. Hens, firewood, whether the pantry roof leaked, whether Eli Mason's carved horse had lost a leg yet. One evening, camped beside a stand of cedar, Margaret took out the photograph of herself and Clara. She held it toward the fire. Simon watched. You going to burn it? I thought about it. Will you? No. She slid it back into the valise. Some memories do not deserve the power of being destroyed. He nodded slowly. Lie, know those? She looked across the fire at him. When we get home, where will you work? Caleb wrote. Mo wants me back after you resign, he says. Resignation under blizzard conditions be considered temporary madness. Margaret smiled faintly. Was it? No. Would you take the badge again? Simon poked the fire. Sparks rose and vanished. Only if the terms change. What terms? No living at the jail. No answering every call as if the dead are keeping score. No leaving my wife to eat supper alone 4 nights a week. Margaret's heart turned over quietly. Your wife might complain if the beans lack salt, she said. She should. Keeps a man humble. Not too humble, I hope. His eyes met hers over the fire. No, he said, not too humble. When they reached San Cordelia, spring had begun arguing with winter. Snow still lay in shaded cuts, but mud softened the roads and water ran bright along the ditches. The town looked the same and not the same. The church bells mercantile, the jail, the house behind it with smoke lifting from the chimney because Mrs. Pike had lit the stove that morning. On the porch rail sat a pot of yellow flowers. Margaret stared. Simon looked equally puzzled. A note was tucked beneath the pot. Mrs. Jolly, for when you come home. The town has been too slow to say it, but we are glad you are here. Mrs. Bell, Mrs. Pike, Mrs. Mason, and others who should have known better sooner. Margaret read it twice. Simon stood beside her. Mrs. Mason, Eli's aunt, I think. Do not sound so suspicious of flowers. I trust flowers. It's the others who concern me. She laughed then, and the sound entered the house before she did. Inside, the rooms felt cold from absence, but not empty. The curtains she had washed hung at the windows. The Bible rested on the shelf beside Ruth's tintype and Anna's blue ribbon. The hens complained loudly from the yard, as if personally offended by her return. Dust lay thin on the table. A patch quilt waited over the chair. Margaret set down her valise. Simon stood in the doorway, watching her as he had watched on the first day. But everything had changed. No platform shame. No borrowed promise. No uncertainty about her name. He took the badge from his pocket. Caleb must have left it on the table, polished bright. Margaret picked it up. "Do you want it back?" she asked. Simon looked at the badge, then at the house. "Yes." She pinned it to his shirt herself. Her fingers trembled only a little. The metal lay over his heart. "There," she said. His hand covered hers before she could step away. "Margaret." She looked up. He did not say a grand thing. He had never been that kind of man. "Stay," he said. The word held every platform, storm, jail cell, graveyard, and road between them. Margaret's throat tightened. "I already came home." His eyes changed, slowly, giving her time to refuse. Simon bent and kissed her. It was gentle, almost questioning, and tasted faintly of coffee and winter roads. Margaret put her hand against his coat, felt the badge beneath her palm, and did not pull away. The town did talk, of course. Towns are made of boards, weather, and talk. But something had shifted. When Horace Bell tried to mutter about false beginnings, Mrs. Bell reminded him loudly that most respectable men began every morning with at least one lie about their own importance. When Leif Drummond's brother sneered outside the livery, Caleb and 3 ranch hands stood beside Simon without being asked. When Margaret walked into church, Mrs. Cutter moved her sewing basket and made room. In April, Eli Mason came to stay for a week, while his father worked lambing season. He arrived with the carved horse in his pocket, one leg indeed broken, and tied with string. Simon repaired it at the table while Margaret kneaded bread. Eli fell asleep that night in the small room that had once held only Clara's trunk and lavender. Before blowing out the lamp, Margaret stood in the doorway and watched the child breathe easy. Simon came up behind her. "Hell wake hungry," she whispered. "Children do. We should keep jam. She glanced at him. "Do not look so pleased. It is only practical, of course." By summer, the yard had changed. Margaret planted beans along the fence and marigolds near the porch because they tolerated heat and neglect. Simon repaired the gate that had always leaned. He built a second shelf in the kitchen for her jars and a proper nesting box for the hens, though he claimed the old one had been fine. Margaret sewed curtains from blue calico Mrs. Bell sold at a discount, but pretended not to. A rolling pin appeared one evening on the table, carved smooth from cedar, with Margaret's initials burned awkwardly into one handle. "H.J.," she read. Simon looked embarrassed. Too many letters, just enough. He had also carved, on the other handle, S.J. She ran her thumb over it. "That is not how rolling pins are usually marked. No. But I suppose it will do." After that, she used it every week. The final test of the promise came in August, when Mr. Voss returned. He rode into San Cordelia in a cream-colored coat and city boots, with Clara's old red ribbon tied around a packet of letters in his hand. He asked for Margaret at Bell's Mercantile, and smiled as if charm could wipe mud from history. "I have information about your sister," he said. Margaret stood behind the counter helping Mrs. Bell measure muslin. "Is she hurt?" No, nothing so dramatic. But she owes me, for what?" He held up the letters. "Promises, affection, money advanced." Margaret's face cooled. "Clara works for her wages. Whatever she owes, send a bill to Denver. I thought her family might prefer discretion." Mrs. Bell's scissors stopped cutting. Margaret understood then. Blackmail wears polished boots as often as dirty ones. Simon entered before she answered. He had seen Voss's horse from the jail and come with that quiet lam and scents for rot under perfume. "Problem?" he asked. Voss smiled. "Private family matter." Simon looked at Margaret. He waited. Once, she might have let shame speak first. Once, she might have tried to pay silence with money they could not spare. But she had crossed too many platforms to fear being seen. "Mr. Voss believes my sister's letters are worth money," Margaret said. Simon's gaze moved to the packet. "Are they stolen?" Voss laughed. "Given freely. Then why hide them? I did not say hide, no. You said discretion versus smile. Finn, Marshal. You cannot arrest a man for carrying letters, no. But I can stand here while my wife answers him. My wife, not shield, not owner. Witness, Margaret stepped forward. Keep them, Mr. Voss. Burn them. Publish them on the church door if you crave attention. Clara was foolish to trust you. But foolishness is not a crime, and shame is not a debt I will pay. Not with coin, not with fear, not with one more mile of running. The store had gone utterly still. Voss' face darkened. You speak mighty bold for a woman who stole a husband from her sister. Simon moved, but Margaret touched his sleeve. No, she said softly. Let me. She faced Voss fully. I took a train because my sister ran. I married under my own name before God and witnesses. The man beside me chose me. When choosing me, cost him something. That is the end of your story about us. Voss looked around and found no friendly face. Mrs. Bell held the scissors like a weapon. Caleb had appeared in the doorway. Even Horace Bell, for once, looked offended on the proper side. Simon took the packet from Voss's hand. Voss protested, but Simon opened one letter, glanced at the top, and folded it again. Addressed to Clara, not yours to sell. She gave them. And now you're giving them to her family, since you brought them so far. Simon's voice was mild. Unless you want me to wire Denver and ask whether the laundry girls there know you trade in women's private words. Voss left town before sundown. Margaret mailed the letters to Clara the next morning with no note except, "These belong to you." Live better. That evening San Cordelia held a church supper under lanterns because the heat had broken, and the sky was kind. Long tables stood in the yard. Children chased one another between wagon wheels. Someone played fiddle softly near the steps. Margaret brought 2 pies, both made with dried apples, because fresh ones were too dear. Simon carried them as if pies were official evidence. Eli Mason ran up and threw his arms around Margaret's waist. "Mrs. Jolly, Pa says I can sleep over next Saturday, if Marshall says." Margaret looked at Simon. Simon pretended to consider gravely. "Depends if you snore." "I don't." "You do," Margaret said. Eli looked betrayed. "Only small?" "Then only a small yes," Simon said. The boy whooped and ran off. At the table, Mrs. Cutter offered Margaret a jar of peach preserves. "I made too much," she said, which everyone knew was not true. Margaret accepted it. "Thank you." Mrs. Cutter hesitated. "I was unkind when you first came." "Yes," Margaret said. The older woman blinked, then nodded. "I am sorry." Margaret looked at the jar glowing amber in the lantern light. "I accept." Simon watched from beside her, pride quiet in his face. Later, when the supper ended and the moon rose white over the desert hills, they walked home with the empty pie tins and the peach preserves wrapped in a cloth. The air smelled of dust, cooling sage, and wood smoke. From the jail, Caleb called good night. From the mercantile, Mrs. Bell waved a lamp. The town no longer felt like a line of witnesses waiting for Margaret to stumble. It felt, cautiously, like a place that might learn. At home, Simon set the jar on the kitchen shelf. Margaret lit the lamp. The room glowed gold. Curtains stirred at the open window. Beans cooled on the stove. Eli's repaired wooden horse stood on the mantel beside Ruth's tintype and Anna's ribbon, because he had forgotten it again, and Simon had not put it away. The rolling pin lay on the table, dusted with flour. The gate outside no longer leaned. The hen settled with soft complaints. On the porch, the yellow flowers had gone leggy, but still bloomed. Margaret took 2 cups from the shelf. Simon looked at her. "Coffee this late? You will drink half and leave the rest." "Will I? You always do." She poured anyway and set his cup where his hand would find it. They sat at the table, not across from each other as strangers now, but near the corner. close enough that Simon's knee brushed her skirt when he shifted. For a while they listened to the night. I used to think the house wanted back what I lost, Simon said. Margaret held her cup in both hands. And now? He looked around the room. The curtains, the mended chair, the child's toy, the flowers in the window, the woman beside him. Now I think it was waiting for what I could still choose. Margaret reached across the table. He met her halfway. Her hand rested in his, rough palm to rough palm, no glove between them. The first time Simon Jolly saw Margaret Holloway, she stood on a depot platform with a borrowed name, a cracked valise, and nowhere in the world to go. He looked at her and said, "I'll take you," thinking he was answering shame with duty. But love, real love, has a way of teaching folks the meaning of their own words long after they speak them. He took her not as a substitute, not as a bargain, not as a mercy offered to a desperate woman, but as the one who brought fire back to the stove, bread back to the table, courage back to his badge, and life back into rooms that had forgotten how to hold it. And when evening settled over that little Utah house, with coffee waiting and the porch flowers bending in the desert wind, anyone passing by could see that the promise made on the platform had finally become home.